The smell was the first thing that hit you. A putrid, overwhelming stench that seemed to seep through the walls of the suburban Wisconsin home. When police finally entered in September 2016, they discovered something that would haunt them forever. A 60-year-old man who had been living with the rotting corpses of his mother and twin brother for over a year. "I was traumatized," he would later tell authorities. But the question that haunted everyone was simple. How does someone live with death for an entire year? And how does a family not notice that two of their loved ones have simply disappeared? Meet the Kwefler family of Wisconsin, a seemingly ordinary American family living quiet lives in suburbia. There was Evelyn, the elderly matriarch who had raised her children with traditional values. Her twin sons, Richard and Kenneth, were both in their 60s, still living the kind of close-knit lives that twins sometimes share. Kenneth Kwefler, 60 years old, lived with his mother Evelyn and twin brother Richard in the family home. To neighbors, they seemed like a typical multi-generational household. Adult children caring for an aging parent, brothers who had never quite separated from the family nest. But behind the closed doors of their suburban home, something was happening that would challenge every assumption about family, denial, and the human capacity to live with the unthinkable. Sometime in 2015, Evelyn Kwefler passed away. The exact circumstances of her death remain unclear. Was it natural causes? An accident? The family would never get complete answers. Around the same time, Richard Kwefler also died. Two deaths in the same household, both unexplained, both undocumented. In a normal family, these would be earth-shattering events requiring funeral arrangements, death certificates, grieving relatives gathering to pay respects. But in the Kwefler house, something extraordinary happened. Nothing. No funerals were held. No death certificates were filed. No relatives were notified. Two people simply stopped existing in the eyes of the world, while one man continued living as if everything was normal. For over a year, Kenneth Kwefler lived in that house with two corpses. One body had decomposed to skeletal remains. The other had essentially mummified in the dry conditions of the Wisconsin home. Think about this for a moment. Every morning, Kenneth woke up in a house with two dead bodies. Every meal he ate was consumed in the presence of death. Every night he went to sleep knowing that his mother and twin brother were decomposing just rooms away. Neighbors later reported that they had noticed a smell coming from the house. But in a society where we mind our own business, where we assume there are reasonable explanations for everything, no one investigated further. The human capacity for denial, for rationalization, for simply continuing to function in impossible circumstances, was about to be tested in ways that psychologists struggle to understand. By September 2016, the smell emanating from the Kwefler house had become impossible to ignore. The putrid odor of decomposition had intensified to the point where neighbors could smell it from their own properties. When you live with something gradually, you become accustomed to it. The phenomenon is called olfactory fatigue. Your nose simply stops registering smells that are constantly present. Kenneth may have genuinely stopped noticing the overwhelming stench that was making neighbors physically ill. But for the outside world, the smell told an unmistakable story. Something was dead in that house, and it had been dead for a very long time. When police finally entered the Kwefler home in September 2016, they were not prepared for what they found. The rotting corpses of Kenneth's mother, Evelyn, and twin brother, Richard, were discovered throughout the house. The bodies, one of them decayed and skeletal, the other mummified, had been dead in his home since 2015. For the responding officers, this wasn't just a crime scene. It was a glimpse into a psychological state that challenged every assumption about normal human behavior. How does someone live with corpses for over a year? The house told the story of a man who had continued living his daily routine while death literally surrounded him. There were signs that Kenneth had been eating, sleeping, and going about his normal activities while his family members decomposed around him. "I was traumatized," Kenneth would later tell authorities. But his statement raised more questions than it answered. If he was traumatized, why didn't he call for help? Why didn't he report the deaths? Why didn't he leave the house? Mental health experts who studied the case were baffled. This wasn't a typical hoarding situation. This wasn't a case of someone hiding evidence of murder. This appeared to be a man who had simply stopped functioning in any recognizable way when faced with loss. Some psychologists theorized that Kenneth might have been experiencing a complete break from reality. Others suggested that the trauma of losing both his mother and twin brother simultaneously might have caused a dissociative state where he simply couldn't process what had happened. The most haunting aspect of this case might be what it reveals about family dynamics and social isolation. Kenneth had other relatives, including a sister who would eventually learn about the horrific discovery. For over a year, family members had apparently not maintained close enough contact to realize that Evelyn and Richard were dead. In our modern world of busy schedules and digital communication, it's possible for people to simply slip through the cracks of family attention. When Kenneth's sister learned what had happened, she had to confront a devastating reality. Her brother had been living in unimaginable conditions while the rest of the family carried on with their lives, unaware that two family members had died and one was slowly losing his grip on reality. From a legal standpoint, Kenneth's case presented unique challenges. He hadn't murdered anyone. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't committed fraud. His crime, if it could be called that, was the failure to report deaths and the improper handling of human remains. But the legal system struggles with cases like Kenneth's because they fall into gray areas between criminal behavior and mental health crises. How do you prosecute someone whose primary crime appears to be an inability to cope with overwhelming loss? The case raised broader questions about social safety nets, family responsibility, and the point at which eccentric behavior crosses the line into something that requires intervention. For the neighbors who had smelled the decomposition for months, Kenneth's case raised uncomfortable questions about community responsibility and the bystander effect. Multiple people had noticed the smell, but suburban politeness and the assumption that someone else will handle it had prevented anyone from taking action. It's a common social phenomenon when everyone assumes someone else will act. No one acts at all. The case became a catalyst for discussions about when neighbors should intervene, when authorities should be called, and how communities can better look out for vulnerable members who might be struggling in silence. Kenneth Kwefler's story doesn't have a neat resolution because it represents something that exists outside our normal categories of understanding. He wasn't evil, he wasn't calculating, and he wasn't trying to deceive anyone for personal gain. He was a man who faced an impossible situation and responded in a way that seems incomprehensible to the rest of us. The loss of his mother and twin brother, the two people he had shared his entire life with, apparently broke something in him that couldn't be repaired. Kenneth Kwefler's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, mental health, and the limits of human resilience. It reminds us that behind every weird neighbor story, there might be someone who is drowning in circumstances they cannot handle. The smell that eventually brought authorities to the Kwefler house was more than just the odor of decomposition. It was the smell of a family that had completely collapsed, of social connections that had failed, and of a man who had been left alone with loss too overwhelming to process. Today, the house where Kenneth lived with death for over a year stands as a reminder that some human experiences exist at the very edges of our understanding. Sometimes people don't call for help not because they don't want to, but because they've forgotten how. When Kenneth told authorities, "I was traumatized," he may have been offering the only explanation he could for behavior that defies explanation. Sometimes trauma doesn't make people dramatic or attention-seeking. Sometimes it makes them disappear entirely, even while they're still alive. His story reminds us that the most dangerous isolation isn't physical. It's the emotional isolation that can happen even when you're surrounded by the people you love most, especially when those people can no longer love you back.